Hello everyone, Michael Pierce here. We are going to pick up right where we left off with section 1 of the prologue of Thus Spake Zarathustra. My hope is not in this video, but in the next video we will finish section 1 and then we can move on to section 2. So that's 4 videos for section 1, which I don't know if that will get any better. I hope so that I'm not, in my 50s by the time that I finish this commentary, but so it's possible that there will just be, it'll be very front-loaded in terms of the content, but we'll just have to see. I'm only going to go at the pace that I feel like I need in order to get all of these ideas out, so we'll just see how it goes. Hope you enjoy it, and here we go. So, Zarathustra inevitably transforms. He has reached that point in his life cycle where he is ripe and must fall from the tree. To inaugurate this transformation, he mimics the rise of the sun and proceeds to deliver the first speech in the book. Let's look at the first line of that speech. O thou great star, what of thy joy hadst thou not those whom thou dost lighten? First of all, Zarathustra addresses the sun as a star. The word used is Gestern, which is neuter in German and contrasts with the feminine of the narrator's earlier word of Sonne. It was pointed out by Lawrence Lampert, a commentator on Thus Spake Zarathustra, that Zarathustra is not here addressing the sun as a god, but as a natural phenomenon with which he feels an affinity. And I would argue that they are, in fact, the same kind of being, namely stars. Stars are another motif in Zarathustra. They represent a perfectly creative and unique individual, insulated from any influence by millions of miles of outer space, eternally shedding their peculiar light throughout the universe. They simply are themselves, and by being themselves, they naturally produce beautiful light to even the most distant places in space and time. They go in orbits, at least from our point of view on Earth, and thus follow a pattern of eternal recurrence. They dance their way across the heavens. Additionally, many ancient cultures, in particular the Greeks, spoke of their great heroes being memorialized in the constellations. In fact, it is said that Dionysus, when he rescued and married the mortal Ariadne, memorialized her with a crown of stars, the corona borealis, which is found near the constellation of Heracles in the inner circle compassing the North Star. In the prelude to his work The Gay Science, Nietzsche includes a series of poems, the last of which is the following, quote, Star morality. Predestined for the starry track, what is, O star, the dark to you? Roll on in bliss through this epoch, its sorrow far and strange to you. To farthest worlds your face belongs, for you a sin would pity be. Just one command pertains to you, pure be. Unquote. The star has achieved a happy eternal orbit and blesses itself continually in and for this happiness. And yet, we have here at the very beginning of Zarathustra a remarkable declaration. What of thy joy hadst thou not those whom thou dost lighten? In other words, what would your happiness be if you did not have anyone to shine for? The star's happiness in its orbit depends upon the benefit it provides to other beings. The happiness of the cook depends upon others benefiting from and enjoying their cookery. The happiness of the artist depends upon someone else being made spiritually richer from their art. And the happiness of the star consists in lightening or lighting, that is, in producing light that blesses others. Right at the beginning of Zarathustra, we have a declaration of a kind of intersubjective ethics, I guess you could say, which seems to clash with the usual picture of Nietzsche as a radical individualist and egoist. Now, this should not be confused with a kind of celebrity addicted to applause or to an elected official dependent upon his voter base. In those cases, what is desired is approval as such, while competency, virtue, and mastery of one's art are all incidental. What matters to them is not that they did a good job, for they do not know for themselves whether it is a good job. They need others to approve of their work, and this approval is their real end goal. They are not artists, but servants, at the beck and call of someone else who knows what they want. If shabby, shallow work wins them applause, then that is what they will do. They live to please others, since they cannot judge themselves. Indeed, they can become rather cross with you if you refuse to be pleased by them. That is, if you refuse to lend them the approval which they cannot provide for themselves. They seek approval like a mosquito seeks blood. Such people have lost touch with themselves. They do not know themselves, and so cannot approve themselves. One is unsure if they even have a self anymore to know. They've become hollow. They are not stars, for a star produces its own light out of its own being. These souls, however, have no inner fire anymore. They take their warmth from others and do not actually produce any warmth themselves. The star is just the opposite of all this. The star produces its own light and warmth. It is thus self-sufficient. But in addition to this mere self-sufficiency, the star produces a surplus or an overflow, which goes on to benefit others. And Zarathustra declares that without this overflow, the star's happiness would be thwarted. To be sure, the star does what it does because that is what it loves to do, and yet its happiness in doing that thing involves someone else benefiting from it. And this, I think, is because helping another person is an expression of one's power. Benevolence involves a display and exercise of power, or better, a kind of overflow of one's power into another's lap. Alternatively, one could be using one's power benevolence to dominate another, by putting them in your debt, or by refusing them the opportunity to develop their own talents, or by making them feel small and weak in comparison to you. These, by the way, are the reasons why many people actively avoid being helped, because they do not like the idea, they don't want to risk being shown up in this way. They have to put themselves into another's power in order to be helped. As a side note, this is one of the many shrewd psychological lessons that I owe to Nietzsche. One must be careful in how one helps others. The benefactor always risks injuring the receiver's pride. People can unconsciously resent you for helping them too openly or too much, since you are making them appear helpless and worthless, not just to other people, but to themselves. But Zarathustra's relationship with the star is not tinged with these kinds of toxic elements, for in the very next line, Zarathustra is not given the star's overflow per se, which would put him in the star's debt. Rather, he takes the overflow for himself and blesses the star for producing it. And independence is maintained between them. We shall see more of this kind of imagery of giving versus taking throughout Zarathustra, but especially in the prologue and in particular in the next section, section 2. But we'll get there when we get there. On to the next part of his speech to the sun. Quote, 10 years thou came up hither to my cave. Thou wouldst of thy light and this way have grown sated, without me, my eagle, and my serpent. But we awaited thee each morning, took from thee thine overflow, and for it blessed thee. Unquote. Again, we have a reference to eternal recurrence, with the sun making the same march every day. Zarathustra claims that the sun would have grown sated with this routine without Zarathustra and his animal companions, who we will address shortly, standing there to receive of the light. In other words, the sun, having nowhere to deposit her boons, her light, her wisdom, her glory, her art, would have filled up after just one cycle. She would have ended her journey and had no reason to continue on. Her course would have been simply a straight, finite line. She would have reached satiety and equilibrium, and thus death. Fortunately, Zarathustra and his companions were present to take from her, so that she had reason to continue on with the cycle. Their presence produces an inequality of energy, which itself produces motion, a bit like the weather, where inequalities in the intensity of the sun's light produce inequalities in the air temperature of the atmosphere, which produces motion of that air from one region to another. The fact that the sunlight does not reach everywhere all at once results in the rushing of the air in order to restore equilibrium. The warmth of the sunlight is thus passed around through the atmosphere. Elsewhere, Zarathustra refers to, quote, this world, the eternally unperfect, an eternal contradictions mirroring, and an unperfect mirroring, unquote. The world is like a sliding block puzzle with no final solution. Rather, it accomplishes every possible arrangement of its finite elements before starting all over again. So if you're not familiar, this is a kind of puzzle where you have like a slab made out of wood, and then you have these thin wood blocks that are placed within the slab, but you have one piece missing, so that you can slide the blocks around, but you can only slide one at a time. So you can slide one into the space that is left empty by the missing block. And usually what you do is you have like a painting or something painted on there, and then you mix it all up by shifting the blocks all over the place, and then the puzzle is to figure out how to shift which block where in order to reconstruct the face. That's the image that I have in my mind. Except here, there isn't a face, or rather, it doesn't matter where you put any of the blocks. Every possible arrangement makes a sensible face. But then when you shift just one block, it makes a new face, if you can imagine something that would be constructed that way. So there's a piece missing, which makes the overall picture eternally incomplete. But through this very incompletion, this very lack, this very emptiness, there is motion, there is change, and there is life. These are made possible because the blocks now have space to move into. In the same way, the sun is sustained in its eternal journey by the very fact that Zarathustra is kind enough to rob, quotation marks, it of its light every morning. In fact, Zarathustra, if you like, is basically milking the sun, lest her udders ache from the fullness. That really is the best image for what he seems to have in mind here. He's milking the sun. Note that they take from the sun her overflow, that is, her superabundance, her surplus. This is another motif throughout Zarathustra, this idea of overflow. The benefit one provides to others ought to be a natural overflow from one's own abundance. Although Nietzsche sometimes claims to stand on the side of selfishness or egoism, his ethics, if we can call them that, transcend the traditional distinction between egoism and altruism. Rather, Nietzsche is about becoming who you are and blessing the world through being that thing. This is my take on what Nietzsche is really getting at. To use some phrasing from Joseph Smith, Nietzsche is advocating for each being to, quote, fill the measure of its creation and have joy therein, unquote. Likewise, Jesus declares in Matthew chapter 5, quote, ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." Unquote. Each being is like a star revolving in the sky. Some stars are brighter than others. Moses or Buddha or Muhammad are very, very bright stars. But every star generates light and completes its divinely appointed circle and has joy therein. Thus, in several of the parables of Jesus, he freely admits inequality of outcome for different saints without this carrying any condemnation. Quote, "He that received seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word, and understandeth it, which also beareth fruit, and bringeth forth, some an hundredfold, some 60, some 30. Unquote. It's from Matthew chapter 13. Each filled the measure of their creation, whether that measure was to be 100 or 60 or 30. They fulfilled that measuring bar that was set for them. We also have the parable of the talents from Matthew chapter 25. I'm actually going to read the whole thing in full because there's just a number of ideas here that, while I may not be able to express them super explicitly, I think fit very nicely into some of the ideas that Nietzsche has. Quote, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. A talent, by the way, while it's kind of a nice coincidence that in English talent means like skill or ability, but in the original context, a talent was a measure of weight, which is apparently, according to my little bit of research I did, about 80 pounds. So if you used it to represent the weight of some amount of money, what this comes down to is a single talent of silver was worth 20 years of labor or so, depending on how you do some of the calculations. So you can actually read this in a way as him saying to one of the servants he gave 5 times 20, so 100 years of life. To another he gave just 40 years of life, and to another he gave just 20 years of life. That's just one way to read it, but in any case, the point is he gave them resources in equal amounts. So unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. To every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them another 5 talents. Which I guess kind of messes with my whole fits up with the lifespan thing. But whatever, I'm leaving that in. The point is, and likewise, he that had received 2, he also gained another 2. But he that had received 1 went and dug in the earth, and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants cometh, and reckoneth with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought another 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou didst deliver unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou didst deliver unto me 2 talents. Behold, I have gained 2 other talents beside them. His Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Just as a little side note here, note that he says the exact same thing to the servant who multiplied the 2 talents as he said unto the servant who multiplied 5 talents. So even though, as it were, they have different sized glasses, they both filled those glasses to the full, as it were. And so therefore they get equal reward in the sense that the Lord says the same thing to them. So that it's very interesting that you have at one and the same time an inequality and an equality, which I can't fully explain except with maybe that notion of the two glasses. They're both full, it's just one is smaller than the other. Now let's see what happens with the one who buried his talent. Quote, "Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee, that thou art an hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast what is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou didst know that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. Thou ought therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take, therefore, the talent from him, and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Unquote. Take note that we have here similar themes of generating a surplus and not merely being self-sufficient. We also have the idea of inequality. Some people start out with more and use that to make even more. But only the last servant is condemned, not because he had so little, but because he did nothing with what he had. Apparently out of some resentment for his capitalistic lord. That's a whole other aspect of the story, which we don't have time to get into here. But he did not make use of the opportunity given him by said Lord. So his light, his glory, was taken and given to another, leaving him exiled in, quote, outer darkness, like a burnt-out star. That which is not exercised atrophies. All things must move to be retained. Or better, all things must multiply, expand, and grow in order to stay alive. This, we shall see much later, is the real meaning and principle behind will to power. The man who was given 5 talents multiplied those talents. The man who was given 2 talents multiplied those talents. Both grew. This actually leads into my final note on this subject, the subject of growth, also of starlight, of shining, of overflow, of benefiting others. I have a quotation from Joseph Smith, again, that comes to mind. It is from a letter that he wrote on the 15th of December, 1840, to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Quote, "Love is one of the leading characteristics of deity, and ought to be manifested by those who aspire to be the sons of God. A man filled with the love of God is not content with blessing his family alone, but ranges through the world anxious to bless the whole of the human family." Unquote. Love is light, which shines outwards. It expands and grows and fills the measure of its creation. Light cleaveth unto light. Now, what of the eagle and the serpent? These 2 mysterious characters are most prominent in the prologue and in the final sections of Part 3. There are a number of important symbols at work here. First of all, Lawrence Lampert points out in his excellent commentary Nietzsche's teaching, An Interpretation of Thus Spake Zarathustra, that when Jesus went into the desert to fast for 40 days, he was, quote, with the wild beasts. The full passage in Mark reads, quote, "And immediately following his baptism by John the Baptist, the Spirit driveth him," Jesus, "into the wilderness. And he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted of Satan, and was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered unto him." Unquote. we can immediately draw a couple of very interesting parallels with Zarathustra. For Zarathustra leaves the lake of his home. Maybe you'll find that a stretch, but for me, it reminds me of baptism. It also reminds me of the Sea of Galilee. We have no explicit temptation scene with Zarathustra. However, in Part 3, Zarathustra relates to a group of sailors how he was once climbing a mountain while forced to carry on his back a sinister dwarf known as the Spirit of Gravity. I described this in video number 7, where I talk about the plot of Zarathustra. This character, the Spirit of Gravity, is actually known as early as Part 1 because Zarathustra there explicitly calls him his devil and also his nemesis. That's in the section on reading and writing. So Zarathustra's devil is the Spirit of Gravity. That's very clear throughout the book, actually. The specific scene that I'm talking about involves the dwarf and Zarathustra arguing about the eternal recurrence. So, my theory is that this scene is a prequel to Zarathustra. That is, it plays out as Zarathustra first leaves his home and ventures into the mountains. Thus, the terrible thought of eternal recurrence was on Zarathustra's mind from the beginning, much as the tempting promise of world domination was on Jesus' mind after his temptation. In Zarathustra's case, the temptation is to not fulfill his destiny of becoming the teacher of eternal recurrence. Also, the temptation to fall into despair at the notion of eternal recurrence. But we'll get into that later, or you can watch my video number 8, where I go a little bit more into what I think is going on there. In the second section of the prologue, we are told that Zarathustra climbed that mountain carrying ashes, from which he constructed, phoenix-like, a new fire. And Zarathustra himself reveals later that, quote, "From my own ash and ember it came to me, this ghost. What happened, my brothers? I overcame myself, my suffering self. I carried my own ashes to the mountain. I invented a brighter flame for myself, and behold, the ghost shrank from me." Unquote. That's from On the Behindworlders. I believe that the dwarf is the ghost that came from that ash. It is also likely that this same dwarf is connected with the devilish jester who caused the tightrope walker to fall, being the Spirit of Gravity. It's kind of a pun on that notion. So when Zarathustra is carrying the dwarf, you can almost imagine the dwarf not like an actual biological dwarf, but like a mythological dwarf, a little hunched over gnome kind of creature sitting on his back in the shape of like a big jar of ash or something is kind of what I'm imagining in my mind. The idea being that the dwarf is weighing him down. In the same way, the jester at the tower with the tightrope walker literally drew him down to earth, and that killed him. So this is a recurring notion. We'll get more into it later, but for now, suffice it to say that the brighter flame that Zarathustra created, which banished the Spirit of Gravity from him, is not the eternal recurrence per se, because after all, they were already arguing about that earlier, but rather the thought of the overhuman's victory over it. The overhuman represents, at least according to my theory from video 8, the being who has escaped the eternal recurrence precisely by fully accepting and willing the eternal recurrence. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself here. Let's return to the matter at hand. So we have the water, we have the desert, and we have the devil. What about the wild beasts, which is kind of what spurred all of this in the first place? They are the eagle and the serpent. It is not stated in Mark's gospel what Jesus' relationship was with the wild beasts, but with Zarathustra, we know that he has befriended them. Zarathustra, in other words, has reconciled himself with his own beastly nature. This was one of the benefits of his solitude, that he was able to get back in touch with his inner beast and come to terms with it in a productive way. He has mastered the body. One can easily imagine this happening with Jesus too, and that this is the real meaning of the idea that Jesus was with the wild beasts while he was tempted. He had to wrestle and tame his inner Lion of Judah in order to have the strength to bear the slaughter without retaliation, like a lamb. Now, Zarathustra's animals are an eagle and a serpent. This is interesting because it's a very ancient symbol. The eagle and the serpent are usually, I would say always actually, depicted as fighting, usually with the eagle prevailing over the serpent. There are, for instance, certain Greek coins which feature an eagle fighting a serpent. One of Aesop's fables is called The Serpent and the Eagle, and talks of how a serpent wrapped itself around an eagle and was trying to choke it to death. A passerby assists the eagle in overcoming the serpent. An eagle devouring a serpent is the coat of arms of Mexico and is derived from Aztec mythology, where the eagle represents the sun god and the serpent represents Quetzalcoatl. In Greek mythology, the eagle is associated with Apollo, also the sun god, while the serpent is more closely associated with the underworld. Thus, the eagle and the serpent have the tension between Greece's bright Olympian mythology and the dark chthonic mystery cults of Dionysus. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche claims this tension was resolved in the institution of Greek tragedy. Apollo and Dionysus, heaven and earth, order and chaos, are united into one aesthetic religious purpose at the tragic festival. Intuitively, the eagle represents heaven, since it flies high in the air. It is thus also associated with the sun and the stars, the gods, and all things that are elevated and spiritual. The serpent slithers on the ground and in caves and waters. It is associated, therefore, with the earth, with material life, also with change, transitoriness, and death, with the ground upon which all higher structures must be built and must eventually return to. But it also represents wisdom, in the sense that wisdom derives from hard experience with the necessities of life. Remember that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was the most cunning of the animals. So, to have the eagle shown as prevailing over the serpent represents heaven prevailing over the earth, the spirit prevailing upon the material, civilization conquering nature, and finally, good overcoming evil, with evil associated always with the earth, material, and nature. In Norse mythology, in the Prose Edda, we hear of how, quote, the squirrel, called Ratatoskr, I think is how you pronounce that, runs up and down the length of the ash, bearing envious words between the eagle and Nidhogg, the snake. The ash here is the world tree, whose height spans the whole created universe. The great serpent Nidhogg lives among the roots of the tree, while an eagle perches on the peak of the tree. The squirrel serves as a messenger of envious words between these two parties. In other words, they're having a bitter squall via the squirrel. I can't help but imagine this squirrel as being like an electric pulse that is sent up and down the spinal cord. Between the lofty cerebral cortex, which is responsible for higher order thought and planning, and the basal sacral region, which is responsible for late-stage digestion and reproduction, i.e., for food and sex. The serpent is said to be gnawing on the roots of the tree, slowly poisoning it and bringing on its downfall, for the serpent is the material world and the dust of the earth, and nothing material lasts forever, least of all living bodies. The tree springs up from the material, reaches loftily into the heavens, but then eventually collapses to the earth again. So, there is conflict between the serpent and the eagle. The eagle wants to perch high in the heavens, while the serpent wants to bring the tree back down. This is the conflict in every living being. That's what I was trying to get at with the spinal cord analogy. It's between their so-called higher functions and aspirations and the necessities and desires of material life, food and sex. But in Zarathustra, this conflict has been resolved, for Zarathustra has befriended both the eagle and the serpent. And in fact, as we will learn at the end of the prologue, the eagle and the serpent are themselves now great friends. Nietzsche is portraying Zarathustra as resolving a conflict that has existed for all of human history, the conflict between material and spiritual, earth and heaven, which has been long dramatized as a battle of good and evil, with the material always being the source of the evil. He is thus, as they say, a uniquely world historical figure, Zarathustra, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, as he imagines him. 3 more points on this. First, I am reminded here of the Mesoamerican deity of Quetzalcoatl, i.e. the bird snake or feathered serpent. More specifically, a quetzal is a species of bird native to Mexico and Guatemala and the very deep southern United States. It has absolutely gorgeous, shimmering green and red plumage. Coatl simply means serpent, so Quetzalcoatl unites this beautiful bird with the serpent. It unites the highest and the lowest into one symbol, a feathered serpent. He is a symbol of the unity of opposites. Interestingly, by the way, he is also known to appear in the form of a harpy eagle when he is associated with the star Venus. My second point, Jesus, upon commissioning his apostles to go forth and preach in his name, says, quote, "Lo, I send you forth like sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore shrewd as serpents and simple as doves," unquote. It's from Matthew 10. It is interesting that Jesus' advice is to unite the qualities of a heavenly creature with an earthly creature, though obviously a dove has very different connotations from an eagle, which therein lies one of the main differences that Nietzsche sets between himself and Christ. Nietzsche, at least ostensibly, does not care much for the meek and the innocent. Again, such is on the surface anyway. In fact, Nietzsche does reference doves in a very important part of the book. It's in the final chapter of part 2 called The Stillest Hour. There, an otherworldly being called the Stillest Hour commands Zarathustra to finally preach what he knows, namely eternal recurrence, and thus effect a revolution in humankind. Zarathustra protests, quote, "I lack the lion's voice for all commanding," unquote. This is late in their conversation, and hitherto, each time the stillest hour has spoken, the following formula introduces it, quote, "Then spake it again without voice to me." This formula occurs 8 times before Zarathustra finally makes the lion comment. Then, before the stillest hour replies, the formula changes. It now says, quote, "Then spake it again like a whisper to me," unquote. The stillest, most silent hour finally vocalizes. It finally is heard objectively, making clear that it is not just something within Zarathustra's imagination, but now has an objective presence. Again, when you actually read it and you notice this, it's like, oh, this is an important line here because it's very repetitive in that chapter, the way that he sets up the voice. And so when there's even the slightest change, you know it's important. And what the voice then says in a whisper is this, quote, "It is the stillest words that bring the storm. Thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world," unquote. Which is one of my favorite quotes from Zarathustra. In any case, doves do have a noble role in Nietzsche's imagery, albeit a smaller role. Finally, Ronald Hayman, in his biography of Nietzsche, points out that in Nietzsche's letters and his notes, he would often compare Lou Salome to an eagle. He does not, to my knowledge, compare Paul Ree, his other friend, to a serpent, but it is worth noting that Nietzsche composed the first book of Thus Spake Zarathustra just after his falling out with Ree and Salome and their effectively abandoning him. So they were certainly on his mind, and it's interesting to think about him making them into an eagle and a serpent, at least when he was first writing Zarathustra, but just an interesting thought. Now for the next line. Quote, "Lo, I am with my wisdom overladen. Like a bee that of the honey hath gathered too much, I too have need of hands outstretched." Unquote. Zarathustra declares here another important reason that he identifies with the sun. He too feels overfull and is in need of others to take from him. He needs others to take from him, to interface with him, to understand him and receive of his wisdom. Just as he has taken from the sun, he wants others to take from him. Thus, the sliding block game of the universe continues as the surplus that originated with the sun shifts from one being to another. Specifically, Zarathustra compares himself to a honeybee gathering nectar, which will be eventually made into honey. His wisdom is thus like golden sweet honey. The sun's rays are also like gold and thus like honey. So we have this triangulation of symbols, honey, gold, and sunshine, with the idea of gifted wisdom being at their center, at their intersection. A honeybee is a worker, and the worker eventually wants to cash out their labor. The honeybee does this by turning all their collected nectar into golden honey. Zarathustra does this, we could say, by turning all his many experiences and thoughts into golden wisdom for himself and others to enjoy. Like the honeybee, he lived in a hive, in a cave, and every day he would venture out to collect wisdom from the natural world, including the sun. He then returned to his cave in the evening to turn this gathered lead nectar into gold, golden honey. Now his cave, his honeycomb, is overflowing with honey, and he desperately wants this hard work to be harvested. It's important to note that Zarathustra asks for hands outstretched. He cannot force anyone to take of his honey wisdom, or at least he does not want to. That would miss the point entirely, for the point is to give a gift. He wants to see the sense of recognition and understanding on the person's face when they get what he is saying to them. These are events where human beings seem to bridge the gap and become more one with each other. At the final chapter of part 1, called On the Gifting Virtue, or On the Bestowing Virtue, depending on the translation, Zarathustra gives a speech about gold, which is, I think, very relevant to what we're talking about here. I won't be able to go over a full explication of it, but that will come when we eventually get to that section. Quote, "Tell me now, how did gold come to have the highest value? Because it is uncommon and useless and gleaming and mild in its luster. It bestows itself always. Only as the image of the highest virtue did gold come to have the highest value. Gold-like gleams the gaze of the bestower. Golden luster makes peace between moon and sun. Uncommon is the highest virtue, and useless. It is gleaming and mild in its luster. A bestowing virtue is the highest virtue. Truly, I guess you well, my disciples. Like me, you strive for the bestowing virtue. What would you have in common with cats or wolves? This is your thirst, to become sacrifices and gifts yourselves, and therefore you thirst to amass all riches in your soul. Insatiably your soul strives for treasures and gems because your virtue is insatiable in wanting to bestow. You compel all things to and into yourselves, so that they may gush back from your well as the gifts of your love. Indeed, such a bestowing love must become a robber of all values, but hail and holy I call this selfishness. There is another selfishness, one all too poor, a hungering one that always wants to steal, that selfishness of the sick selfishness, unquote. So we have some sort of honeybee imagery in there too. It's implicit, but with the notion of gathering all of these things into themselves so that it may gush back forth, right? It's sort of this, the honeybee is a creature that devours something, namely the nectar, but then through that devouring of it and digesting it, turns it into gold. It's almost like a hen laying golden eggs or something. So that's kind of what happens with wisdom, right? You experience something, you process it, and then you provide it to others after it's been processed. So very much like a like a honeybee making honey. Again, I can't explain the full passage now, but I wanted to leave it with you because of its relevance to the imagery of gold and honey. Note also that Nietzsche does not divide people into the selfish and the unselfish, but rather into the healthy selfish and the unhealthy selfish. For Nietzsche, there is no such thing as genuine unselfishness, any more than there is such a thing as genuine unlife, as distinct from death. All living things are, quote, selfish. It is simply a matter of how they are selfish. There are many horribly selfish people who are always on about selflessness and acting selflessly for one's fellow man, especially when that fellow man is themselves. So it's no guarantee that somebody talking about selflessness is actually going to be selfless, and any more than somebody talking about, the virtues of selfishness is actually going to be genuinely selfish. People misunderstand themselves all the time. Moving on to the final line that I want to talk about in this video anyway. Quote, I want to libate and to divvy, till the wise among men once again of their folly and the poor once again of their riches rejoice, unquote. The German here is verschenken und austeilen, to give away and to hand out. I have rather imaginatively translated them as libate and divvy. The word schenken is important in Zarathustra because it means to give away, to bestow, to give as a gift, with the last perhaps being the closest definition. This is the same word Zarathustra uses, by the way, for the chapter on the gifting virtue or on the bestowing virtue. Most of the time, I translate it as to gift. Here, however, I chose libate in the sense of pouring out libations. A very imaginative translation, but my reason for that is the word schenken apparently can also mean archaically to pour a drink for another person. And I feel at least slightly comfortable using that more archaic meaning because the spelling that Nietzsche uses a number of times throughout Thus Spake Zarathustra is the archaic spelling of the German words. For example, austeilen is an archaic spelling of austeilen. I don't think it's pronounced differently, but there's this extra H in there. It means to distribute and thus to hand out, to dish out, or even to hand around. So I confess that I could not resist interpreting these words taken together here as a reference to the Last Supper. Jesus serves his disciples wine, saying it is his blood, and breaks bread to distribute among them, saying it is his body. In other words, he pours out wine, his blood, and hands out bread, his own broken body. He libates and divvies himself. This reference is apt because Zarathustra is talking about disseminating himself in the way that the sun does, giving to all liberally of his overflow and being blessed for it. We will see more and more that this is a sacrificial act on Zarathustra's part, like a ripe fig falling from a tree and bursting upon the ground. He says as much in On the Gifting Virtue. Zarathustra then says that the result of his fruitful sacrifice and dissemination will be that, quote, the wise among men will again of their folly, and the poor will again of their riches rejoice. We know that what Zarathustra intends to distribute and pour out is his wisdom, that is, his honey, his gold, his sunshine, his gift. But should not the wise thereby become wiser, and the poor wiser too? But what we are hearing of here is the ultimate effect of this wisdom upon their souls. Through his wisdom, the wise realize their folly. They are shown up by Socrates, as it were, and discover that their own wisdom is really folly. Yet they rejoice in this. Why? Because this is itself an increase of their wisdom, to learn that they do not know. They are thus primed for more learning. The image is fascinating because it involves Zarathustra pouring wisdom into the wise and thereby emptying them, but this emptiness is itself a filling up. They are unlearning that they may learn better. There is thus also a revolution going on here, a turning of the wheel, a recurrence. I should also mention, though, that that's one interpretation. Another interpretation, which may begin to, I only thought of this now and I want to throw it in here. This may crop up a bit later. It's possible that he's saying something slightly different, that he's saying folly is itself a kind of wisdom, referring to a kind of poetic or imaginative, creative wisdom. But we'll get to that later. I'm going to stick with my more Socratic version of it now. You can apply effectively the same thing to the poor. Is the poor now rich because Zarathustra gives them riches? Maybe, but I'm inclined to think that it's kind of more like what happened with the wise, where they realize the richness of their poverty, of what their poverty has given them, perhaps. Maybe through their suffering, they realize the benefit that their suffering actually gives them and therefore realize that they are rich. You could also imagine that perhaps the overflow from the wise goes into the cup of the poor. But I'm not sure that that's quite right. I actually prefer they realize that in their poverty it actually has given them riches. So anyway, that's enough for this video. I want to give a few hints, though, of the next video, which will hopefully finish off this first section of the prologue. And what I want to emphasize here, because what's going to really come up in the next video, is that Zarathustra is proposing to effectively sacrifice himself. Now, there isn't a sacrifice in Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's not like he literally gets torn to pieces, but there is a metaphorical sacrifice, I think. The idea here is that he sacrifices himself to provide riches and goodness and wisdom to his followers. And it's Nietzsche, right? So it's not in a purely altruistic way in the way that we would normally think, and yet there's something extremely beautiful about it when it's properly understood. This sacrifice is what Christ does. It's also what Dionysus does. Christ becomes food for his followers and drink. Like Dionysus, he is torn to shreds by the world and devoured. His blood is drank to make drunken. He is going to mimic the sun's course in doing this. For the sun dies every day and descends every night into the underworld to bring light unto it. So even the dead are redeemed. Through his sacrifice he will effect a revolution in humankind, and this simply as a consequence of the potent honey he has stored up in his soul. When he is broken open, when he disseminates his wisdom, all heaven breaks loose, and a wild principality takes up residence among the children of men. Quite frankly, I am understating the parallels that I see, at least with Christ and Dionysus here with Zarathustra's speech, but we will get into that in the next video or in a later video. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.